Hello. I didn't see you there. Welcome to Fake News. March 30th. Let me put this book down. But seriously, welcome back. It is March 30th. I see I don't have quite as many viewers as last time. That's all right. The stream will be on YouTube. Um, I'll be saved there. One thing I like about YouTube, it saves the stream automatically, gives you closed captioning, and just works pretty seamlessly for me. So hope everybody's doing well. This week we're going to be talking about democracy and its relation to the idea of public relations. Um, I'm just hoping that the audio's working okay. So if you're out there and you can hear me, let me know. I'll just put that in the chat box just to make sure that everything's okay. I'll give it a minute for more people to come online. Audio is working. That's great. Thank you, Alex. So let's get things started. All right, thank you, Mason. Yes, audio is working. Okay, so we are in our last few weeks of the class. Let me begin just by talking a little bit about last week's. I thought I should give you kind of a quick summary of what we talked about last week. Then we're going to talk about the assignments that are coming due. Then I'm going to discuss this week's content. I'm going to try to keep it to about an hour. So last week, I hope I didn't lose you guys. It was a class on Jason Stanley's theory of what propaganda is. Now, in general, propaganda is when you use any kind of non-rational means to manipulate people's beliefs. By non-rational means, I just mean things that aren't necessarily based in evidence or arguments. It could be appeal to emotion. So propaganda, Stanley says, is going to be particularly bad when it's used in the service to defend an unjust ideology. An ideology, of course, is a set of beliefs about the world that is usually taken to be kind of a whole unto itself. It explains everything. There's no room for dissent in it. And the people who believe in the ideology usually don't take criticism well, and they think they have the answer to every problem. So when an ideology is particularly unjust, it uses propaganda to defend itself. And we can recognize this bad kind of propaganda, Stanley argues, by the following aspects. First, most important aspect to me is that propaganda, in fact, because it's being used in a bad way, undermines any ideal that it appeals to. So one really good example that I owe to one of our students was from Animal Farm. So if you've read Animal Farm, the slogan, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, in fact, is not about equality, but it's used to undermine equality. So propaganda undermines itself, undermines the ideals it appeals to, the bad kind. Bad propaganda defends an unjust form of inequality. I don't have an ethical theory right now for you guys in terms of what counts as unjust inequality, and I'm not going to give you one. I'm just going to give you, I hope, examples that are fairly uncontroversial. For example, the idea that, in the United States, prior to the Civil Rights Act, that there was a division between races as an unjust form of inequality that propaganda tried to defend. And finally, bad propaganda prevents rational discourse. It makes it hard to go into the public sphere, makes it harder to have reasonable, rational debates between people. Right? It heightens division, it portrays disagreement as evil, it becomes an obstacle to democracy. Uh, let me just answer this question. And I wanted to link it to the idea of online discourse now, because propaganda on the internet today is a lot more subtle than the propaganda campaigns of generations past, because we can look at these propaganda posters and see them for what they are. Whereas contemporary propaganda, in order to be effective, cannot be seen for what it is. So a common tactic, for example, online is to pretend to be your political opponent and say or do ridiculous things to make them look bad by association. And I consider this a form of propaganda because, unlike other forms of fake news, which can be made for money, for political, you know, in the service of some other thing, getting ratings or whatever, propaganda online is strictly ideological. So the ideological use of misinformation from any actor, whether it's a government, whether it's an individual, whether it's the outright or whoever, that's what I'm going to think of when I think of online propaganda. So it has to be ideological in the sense of ideology we already discussed. Um, and it has to have these kind of these kind of Jason Stanley criteria that we just talked about in the other slides. Another example I have is, and there's a link here, when we're talking about alt-right recruitment campaigns. These are mass propaganda campaigns. They're not created to make money in the fake news sense. They're not there to prop up a specific government's point of view on something. These are deliberately dishonest attempts and manipulation online created to serve an ideology, not just your ordinary garden variety political belief. That link there, by the way, is really explicit discussion of online neo-Nazi propaganda. Proceed at your own risk if you click and follow through on that link. And one other thing I wanted to do last week. So I wanted to talk about Jason Stanley's theory of propaganda. I wanted to link it to online ideological manipulation. And I want to frame the overall issue, and this is maybe too abstract for the class. I wanted to frame the overall issue in terms of Michel Foucault's theory of biopower. That's Foucault up there in the corner. So Foucault says, look, if you want to understand the mechanisms of power in modern society, you can't think of just violence or coercion. You can't just think of soldiers or the police or jails, which is different now. Power is expressed generally not through violence but through institutions, and this power is not bent on repression. It's actually based on generation. It wants to create things. It wants to normalize. It wants to educate, track, develop, normalize, orient people towards social goals, more or less by convincing them. You want literacy campaigns, public health campaigns, training, right, through schools, courts, media, hospitals, workplaces, right? That's what Foucault calls biopower. It's just we're regulating human life through non-violent means, and that's actually mostly been a good thing. Right? When Foucault says this, he's not critiquing the idea of biopower. He'd probably consider it like a really strong form of progress. Nevertheless, we have to understand it for what it is. And I want to say, look, propaganda is part of this attempt to regulate human life and activities. We are going through a massive biopower campaign that's unprecedented in 100 years right now. Social distancing, the idea that we can't go to our workplaces unless they're essential, that we can't go to fan shop, to our classes, that I have to be online right now. This is a huge difference in human behavior from just what it was a month ago, done for public health reasons. How do you get that without having police roaming the streets and arresting people? We might get to that point, but we're not at that point yet. So we have other avenues. And what's really interesting to me is that in the age of the internet, governments are no longer the only source of this power. Typically, when Foucault's thinking of biopower, he's thinking of governments first, and maybe very large companies second, but mostly governments. Governments are really the seat of biopower. They're the ones that run the schools. They have the courts, right? They regulate workplaces. They often either run or regulate very tightly hospitals. Um, they're able to push campaigns like public health campaigns. Um, right? I mean, I had an alert on my phone just the other day using the kind of the Amber Alert, the emergency system, saying, if you were traveling, you have to stay home. Um, but because of the decentralization of media, and what by that I mean the fact that every citizen with an internet connection and a laptop can make a YouTube video like I'm making right now, um, the average person has a media reach that they did not have 20 or 30 years ago. And if you're clever and if you work with other people, you too can take a little bit of this biopower and try to regulate and through biopower try to coordinate other people's lives. So it's really an interesting shift in power. That's all I wanted to say here. Um, so, so that was last week. And again, if you have any questions, I'm looking at the chat box right now. I'm definitely reading my email, and I'm willing, just send me an email and I'll answer your questions you have. Things are a little busy right now, as you can imagine. I'm working from home. I have a couple kids. I'm behind on my grading, but I'm doing my best. So let's talk about what's coming due. Online quiz number 2 closes April 5th. So please go and do that online quiz. Your short essays are due a week after that. Right? I want a couple pages, 2, maybe 3 pages, on one of the topics that I list to you. If you don't know where to find the essay topics, send me an email and I'll can point you in the right direction, or I'll just copy paste the topics in the email itself. So please get started on those essays. I'm really looking forward to reading them. After that, we just have 2 more things, right? You're going to take your case study, turn it into a PowerPoint. I've talked about that last week. The idea is that you create a PowerPoint and then you either do a screen capture, or you take your smartphone, you take a video, or you just create a short narration. So make that presentation for me. It's going to be individual, group work is canceled. And there's a final test, a final quiz online. It's going to be a little bit longer than the other quizzes, but it's basically the same idea. 15%. This one's going to be cumulative over the course. That's also going to be closing April 24th. So those are the 4 things I need you to finish for this class. And if you have, again, any questions at all, send me an email and we'll work on those. So this week, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat box as well. So this week, I'm getting a little abstract again. As I said, I posted an announcement on FOL. A lot of students were asking me about kind of the fake news in relation to coronavirus, because there's a lot of it online. So go to FOL, look at the announcement. The gist of it is that some fact-checking organizations like Snopes have actually been pulling back a little bit. Their staff is overwhelmed by the amount of misinformation, and they're really focusing on only very prominent cases. And I think that's probably a healthy attitude. We should all pull back from the internet a little bit. And the reason I get very abstract in this class, the reason I'm talking about a theory of propaganda, or I want you thinking about the idea of biopower as opposed to other forms of power, is to really kind of step back and have a more abstract understanding of information and misinformation, so that instead of following the news cycle specifically, instead of following a specific story very closely, we take a step back and we have kind of a more global, nuanced understanding of it, so that we can interpret specific events through the lens of our theory. And these 3 weeks, where we do Stanley's theory of propaganda, then we talk about Freud and Bernays in the context of democracy, and then totalitarian propaganda, are probably the 3 most theoretical weeks in the whole class. And I'd much rather not do this online, but do it in a classroom, because they're so abstract, because they're so theoretical. But I'm hoping that this theory, that this abstract approach, is applicable to the situation we find ourselves in. So this week, I'm going to talk a little bit about where democracy came from historically. And that has to do with some of the assumptions of the Age of Enlightenment. And I want to contrast the idea of enlightenment, right, which is this kind of like a 17th, 18th theory idea, with more modern views, including postmodernism and public relations, which in fact view the voting public with a great deal of suspicion. Enlightenment, modernity, just kind of assumed humanity was rational. That was like one of the main features of who we are. We are rational creatures, and that's why we can be trusted with democracy. An increasing focus on the irrational started showing up in the 20th century. But if the public is irrational, they cannot be trusted with the mechanisms of power in a democracy. So you might hear in your life, you might hear the terms modern and postmodern. What is postmodern? I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But the idea is modern and postmodernity definitely clash fundamentally on this idea of whether we are reasonable, rational creatures. So, can democracy survive irrationality? Is kind of the main through line here. So in this section is on the Enlightenment and rationality. Well, let's get. So if you've never heard this term before, the Enlightenment is a historical period in the 17th and 18th centuries where a number of different philosophical and social movements really dominated the intellectual scene and really had a profound influence on governments. The principal goals of these Enlightenment thinkers, I'm thinking like there's British thinkers, there's German thinkers like Kant. The American founding fathers were very strongly influenced, particularly Jefferson, by the Enlightenment, and they were interested in human liberty. They strongly believed in the possibility of progress and change. They were believers in reason and how reason and rationality could improve the world. In tolerance, the idea that we should tolerate differences of opinion, specifically religious opinion, and that the power of church and state should be limited to prevent their abuse. Right. So the idea, for example, the separation of powers in the United States, which is really enshrined in the governments. You have a difference between the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, right, between Congress and the Senate and the presidency and the courts, right? The separation of powers was an Enlightenment ideal. John Locke argued for it in the two treaties of government. So, yeah, this was a very strong movement in Germany, in France, in England, and a lot of it was a reaction to religious warfare. So Tobias is saying online, look, humans are by nature are irrational beings. So I would say to that we are at least partly rational and partly irrational. The question is whether or not the parts of us that are rational can anticipate and manage the irrational parts. But as we get to post-modernity, you'll see more and more people agreeing with your point here, that we're more irrational than rational. And we're going to have to be careful about that, what that means. So the Enlightenment definitely comes out of the aftershocks of the Protestant Reformation. I don't want to do too much history, but the basic thing is, of course, there was a very profound schism in the Christian world. The Protestant Reformation broke away from the Catholic Church, creating a few hundred years of warfare in Europe. So we could... This was particularly pitched in Germany, but there was also, of course, fighting in France and Spain and England. And eventually some people said, hey, we need to stop killing each other over our religious differences and use reason and tolerance in order to get society to a part where we're stable again. We can, let me just do one quick historical thing here, and let me talk about the Peace of Westphalia. So the Peace of Westphalia, I'm hoping this works, was an important part of the ending of religious warfare in continental Europe. So the idea is that in 1648 there was this peace signed, which ended the wars of religion, including the 30 Years' War in Europe. And part of the principle there was that the state authorities had the kind of final say over religion in the sense that the ruler's religion would be the religion of the state, and then there'd be no more fighting about it. This was an important part of the establishment of the modern state system. Hold on, let me just get my slides loaded up again. Because it affirmed the sovereignty of the nation-state over the sovereignty of the church, and secondly, laid the groundwork for religious tolerance, if indirectly, by saying that we should tolerate each other's national religions, which eventually led to the idea that we should tolerate each other's personal religions. But that was a long time coming. So the Enlightenment is an area where we slowly develop the ideas of liberty, progress, reason, tolerance, separation of church and state. We also have increasing, development of science, increasing empiricism, which is the view that scientific observation is what leads to knowledge. So it's a very, very important time there. So Immanuel Kant wrote an article called What is Enlightenment in the 18-somethings, where he tried to kind of sum up the themes of this time. He says, and let me just read you this quote, because it really does sum up the optimism of the time. He says, look, what is this thing we're calling enlightenment in Europe? He says, it is the emergence from our own self-imposed immaturity. We are immature, right? It's the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolving courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude. Dare to know, which is Latin for dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment central ideal was individual intellectual freedom and tolerance. The model of rule at that point was very, I'd say, paternalistic in the sense that the subjects of rule, the average citizen, the average serf, peasant, was ruled by a king or a lord, much the same way that a father would rule over his children. Right? The children, a 5-year-old child cannot stay home alone. Right? The first thing they would do is grab a fork, jam it in an electrical outlet, and die. Likewise, the average person, in relation to the king, to the lord, to whoever, was viewed as a child. They needed guidance from someone else. They couldn't act on their own. The Enlightenment rejects this. They say the individual person can be trusted to use their own understanding. Individual people, right, should not be treated as children. Grown, citizen, adults can be trusted with their own understanding. Right? Reason is part of our natural endowment. It's part of human nature. Social problems, according to the Age of Enlightenment, are generally caused by ignorance, not by malice. People aren't evil, they're ignorant. And if they only knew what the right thing was, they would of course do it. Right? Most problems are caused by ignorance and superstition. But there's a lot of potential for the development of human reason. So if we want to solve social problems, these thinkers said, we need mass literacy, we need education. The human condition can be improved if we really focus on the problems of ignorance and superstition. And they were very practical about this. So the encyclopedia was this massive undertaking which had a goal of combining philosophy, engineering, science, and medicine into one book. well, one series of books that would hopefully enlighten people and thus, right, cause them to act better. So here's the preface to the encyclopedia. The goal of an encyclopedia is to assemble all the knowledge scattered on the surface of the earth, to demonstrate this general system to the people with whom we live, to transmit it to the people who will come after us, so that the works of centuries past is not useless to the centuries which follow, that our descendants, by becoming more learned, may become more virtuous and happier, and that we do not die without having merited being part of the human race. Right? Again, this is a great summary of what the Enlightenment was all about. The idea that if you just give people knowledge, they will become more virtuous and happier. That's what we need to do. And I think this is a very poignant quote if we think about it in terms of the internet, which is that we have assembled all the knowledge of the earth and put it on the internet, but we've also assembled a lot more than knowledge. We have also assembled all the ignorance on the earth and put it on the internet. So I guess we still need curation. But there's very much an optimism here, right? That we can solve social problems through reason and education and science. Oh, here's the front cover page of the encyclopedia. 28 volumes, 71,000 articles, 3,000 illustrations in the 18th century. So this was put together, and this blows my mind, right? You had no computers, right? You had no software. You didn't really have typewriters. Like the amount of work put into this is just staggering, and they really believed it was going to help. It makes Wikipedia look like nothing compared to the amount of work put into this thing. So reason is just part of who we are as human beings. It can be cultivated. Now, are we irrational? Yes and no. We are irrational to the extent that if we don't develop our reason, we won't be strong in it, right? Our rationality, our intelligence is a bit like a muscle that if you don't go to the gym and work it out, you are not going to, right, be strong in your reason. I usually talk a little bit about the idea of natural religion as well, because it has a link to the principles of tolerance, political tolerance. But I'm just going to skip. I'm just going to skip ahead some slides here. I have some slides about Adam Smith and how the free market was also part of this democratizing impulse. But I'm just gonna slip out of it because I want to keep this under an hour. I'm just going to skip some slides here. But the basic idea here is that democracy coming out of Europe was definitely a function of Enlightenment optimism about human nature, and specifically optimism about the potential of rationality. And that if we are reasonable, rational beings whose condition can be improved by education, then we can be trusted not just to have our own opinion, as Kant said, not just to have the courage of our own reason, but we can also be trusted with power. Right? Democracy will work out. It won't just be mob rule. It will be something else, something more noble, something more refined. Democracy can actually be a very powerful way of ruling, self-rule, in virtue of rationality. But then in the 20th century, we have something happening here, which is a certain optimism in human nature begins to wane, and we have a return of a kind of a theoretical emphasis on irrationality. Now, why did this happen? That's a very good question. Part of it had to do with a series of historical events that really shattered specifically European confidence in human reason. There was imperialism and colonialism of the late 19th, early 20th century. And there were, of course, the two world wars. The Enlightenment thinkers believed in human rationality and social progress. In fact, many of them believed history had a inevitable direction of increased progress. That if you're a modern thinker and you think of the future, you're thinking in what's society going to be like 100 years from now, you're naturally thinking of a time where we're more tolerant, a time where society is more advanced, where technology is more developed, where there's less scarcity, less suffering, and that this is basically inevitable. If you think of the future, you're thinking of a time that is better. Post-modernity challenged this. It said, look, progress is not inevitable. History doesn't have a direction. Human rationality is limited. We don't know what the future will be, right? We could be in a new dark ages 100 years from now, right? History does not progress in an inevitable direction. Let's see. Yeah. So there were a number of different critiques here. So why did people start becoming suspicious of Enlightenment ideals? Number of reasons. One, the increasing power of the nation state really shocked people in the sense that they thought the modern state would repress individuals instead of freeing them. So the idea is that the nation state, governments would become too powerful, even democratic governments. And instead of freeing people, it would repress them. Another worry was that science had limits. It would not actually be able to give us all the answers. We'd have some of the answers, but really fundamental questions about human nature, ethics, consciousness, God would not be able to be answered by science. And then you had a series of historical events. You had, of course, colonialism, which was the rush of European countries into places like Africa and North and South America to establish little private fiefdoms. I don't have slides on this specifically, but for example, you can look up the Belgian Congo for a sense of how bad things got during the colonial period. And then you had the World Wars. If you know anything about World War I, it was one of the most horrific experiences you can imagine for the soldiers. And World War II somehow was even worse. And many authors of this period were struck that it was science and rationality and the nation state which it didn't prevent these horrors, it enabled the horrors of the world wars. It was science and rationality that gave us some more sophisticated weapons, culminating in nuclear weapons. It was bureaucratic rationality and management systems and filing systems and that enabled Nazi Germany to round up millions of people for extermination. So how did science and rationality and the nation state lead us to this awful circumstance? So what was happening in the 20th century is that in the immediate aftermath of the First World War and the Second World War, people said something has gone wrong with our assumptions about humanity. We thought science and democracy and rationality would deliver us a more enlightened world. And instead, what we've seen is war and massacre. What happened? So we have to find out what happened to prevent it from happening again. So if you hear post-modernity, the term postmodern online, when people are talking about it, I know that the idea of the postmodern, a lot of people on YouTube talk about it. A guy like Jordan Peterson talks about postmodern neo-Marxism, whatever that's supposed to be. How I want to frame the postmodern is an intellectual reaction to the first half of the 20th century, World War I and II, that made them question the Enlightenment ideals that did not prevent these horrors from happening. And in fact, the worry was that it had enabled these things rather than prevent them. So we're skeptical about progress, we're skeptical about rationality, we're skeptical about science, and we're skeptical about history having a direction to it. So really, it's when I say why I kept repeating we're skeptical about, that's because postmodernity is a skeptical outlook. It's not a series of beliefs; it's a series of questions. Which leads me to want to talk about Sigmund Freud. But before I do so, I'm keeping an eye on the comment box. I see I got a few viewers here. If you have any questions, right, just type in and I'll press pause and I'll see what I can do in terms of answering it. So the basic idea here is that modern democracy comes out of the belief that humans are basically good, rational creatures. And in the 20th century, we start having our doubts about that. So what went wrong? So Freud has a few ideas. Sigmund Freud is probably a name we're all maybe familiar with. He has a theory of the unconscious. You might think of kind of the Oedipus complex when you think of Sigmund Freud, right? Which is the idea that, right, everybody wants to, every male wants to subconsciously, unconsciously murder their father and sleep with their mother, and that it's something you have to work through. And it's a little weird, but it's very influential in his time. And the most profound contribution is this idea of the unconscious, which is a critique of the idea of rationality in a way. What Freud was saying is that, look, human beings aren't rational a lot of the time. They're actually acting on motivations they're not really aware of. And then after the fact, I explain it or rationalize it. But really, I'm acting on the basis of unconscious impulses. So I'm not aware of the motivations for my actions. It's buried. There's a little image here of an iceberg. You probably can't see it because I'm in the way. Let me see if I could just move my screen here. There. I don't know. Let me know if that worked. So over here, right, we have the conscious brain. This is the part that we're aware of. We're aware of our own thoughts. But the unconscious mind is where all the action happens, according to Freud. Let me move my little screen back here. The unconscious mind is where all the action happens. And this map of the unconscious that Freud provided said, here's how we can explain irrationality. Here's how we could predict human behavior, which is, in fact, irrational. Here's how we can treat mental illness, right? It's all happening at the unconscious level. It also suggested that the best way to communicate might not be the appeal to reason, because if we're not motivated by reason when we act, Freud says, we're motivated by unconscious impulses, the best way to communicate people might be by appealing to their unconscious impulses. Stuff that they're not even aware they're being influenced by. And there's a really interesting historical connection here. Because it was Freud's nephew, an American called Edward Bernays, who really launched the field of modern, what we call public relations, PR, spin, advertising, right? He created the term public relations because propaganda just had negative connotations. And he wrote a couple of really seminal books in the field of public relations. So if you're interested in mass communications and public relations in the history of the advertising field, Bernays is really the founder. Like, you can't avoid him. In his 1928 book, Propaganda, he says, look, the manipulation of the organized habits and the opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. So Bernays is Freud's nephew, very, very familiar with Freud's work. And he's saying, look, people are not rational. People act on the basis of their unconscious impulses. And if you understand how this works, you're supposed to manipulate the masses, because this is how you're going to have a democracy that actually functions. And this is kind of what, so I posted a video documentary online. It was called, gosh, I'm blanking on what it was, what it's called, Century of the Self. Adam Kurz, this is a BBC documentary on Edward Bernays and the link to Freud. And you watch part one because it really gets into the historical link here, how the field of public relations was very much a reaction to Freud and the idea that people are going to be unconsciously motivated and that you can kind of like appeal to this. Is the USA, so is this why some people refer to the USA as a failed democracy? I don't know. I guess it would depend on the specific person saying that and why. There are obviously criticisms of American democracy that we can get into. You know, there's issues with the two-party system, with the lack of transparency in campaign finance, the reliance on public relations, quote-unquote propaganda. So we can definitely talk about that. So for people who are critical of Bernays, this is a really crucial component of why, in the United States specifically, democracy has always been tenuous at best for the critics here. So Bernays argues in his book, this is 1928, he has a book called Propaganda, before he started referring to his own field as public relations. He says, look, we are governed and our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested by men we've never heard of. And this is the logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. We have a problem here. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate if they're to live together in a smoothly functioning society. So how do we ensure this cooperation occurs? Right? Well, how do we do this? This is a technical problem, right? To be solved by the invisible government. And how to do so, how to be part of this invisible government, is the focus of Bernays' book and why he wants to create the field of public relations. And again, he's writing in 1928. We've just seen literally the worst warfare between humans that has ever happened in history. To prevent it from occurring again is one of the main motivations of the people focusing on the ways in which people are predictably irrational. As civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented. His chapter is called Organizing Chaos. Right? He was writing in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. The need for an invisible government has been demonstrated. And now we have the technical means to do so, to prevent this from happening again. There's a nice little piece on literacy here. Right, so again, Bernays is very conscious of Freud and very conscious of the Enlightenment. He says, the Enlightenment thinkers believe that universal literacy, right? Literacy was supposed to educate the common man to control his environment. Once he could read and write, he would have a mind fit to rule. So ran the democratic doctrine. So the Enlightenment thinker said, we're going to write, we're going to make an encyclopedia, we're going to teach every person to read it, their ignorance will be cured, they will become rational, and they will become fit not just to rule themselves, but to partake in a mechanism by which all of society rules itself through democracy. So ran the democratic doctrine. But instead of his own mind, universal literacy has given him rubber stamps. Rubber stamps inked with advertising slogans, with editorials, stamp, with published scientific data, stamp, with the trivialities of the tabloids, the platitudes of history, quite innocent of original thought. Each man's rubber stamps are the duplicates of millions of others, so that when those millions are exposed to the same stimuli, all receive identical imprints. So what people think of as their original thoughts, Bernays says, is not in fact original thoughts. What literacy has given us is not individual rationality. It has rather given us mechanism for imprinting minds on a massive scale. And really, I'm sorry to quote so much from Bernays, but reading this is fascinating to me as someone in the context of this fake news class, where this mechanism of imprinting, as with a rubber stamp, is no longer just through newspapers or radio, which was the dominant forms of media in Bernays' time, but also through social media now, where we have much more sophisticated methods of imprinting. And this fascinating novelty, which is that every person with a laptop and an internet connection is themselves engaged in imprinting. They can be a media person. And what does this mean? So for Bernays, right, we're all acting unconsciously, right? Man is by nature gregarious. Humans are social creatures. And we feel ourselves to be a member of a herd, of a group, even when we're alone. Our minds retain the patterns which have been stamped by group influences. Unrelated. A man sits in his office deciding what stocks to buy. He imagines, no doubt, that he is planning his purchases according to his own judgment, but his judgment is his melange, his mixture of impressions stamped on his mind by outside influences, which unconsciously control his thought. It is chiefly Freud who has pointed out that many of man's thoughts and actions are compensatory substitutes for desires, which he has been obliged to suppress. A thing may be desired not for its worth, but because he has unconsciously come to see it as a symbol for something else, the desire for which he is ashamed to admit to himself. But let's get back to Freud for a sec here. Freud says most of our motivations are unconscious. And he wants to map out this thing. What does his map actually say? One of the key claims of Freud is that we suppress things. We suppress behaviors and desires that aren't socially acceptable. This is part of our developmental psychology. Children have desires and they act on them. The parents say no. The child learns to suppress the desire. But the desire is still there, it's just suppressed. And you either learn to suppress it properly or you don't. If you don't, that's mental illness, according to Freud. I don't really believe this theory, but maybe there's a little bit of truth to it. If you do manage to suppress it successfully, you exchange your desire, your forbidden desire, for something socially acceptable that represents the desire you're not supposed to have. It's as Bernays puts it, it's a substitute. So if there's something you're not allowed to have, you suppress that desire and you reach for a substitute. And Bernays understood this very well. And he says, public relations and the manipulation of the masses will occur specifically by doing this. We need to find out what people unconsciously want. We need to influence them to substitute their suppressed desires for something else. And we're going to decide what that something else is going to be. We need to figure out what people are suppressing and then offer them something in return. And we're going to do this not by appealing to their reason. We're going to do this not through argument or evidence. We're going to be substituting their suppressed desires by appealing to their unconscious, and that's how we're going to do advertising. That's how we're going to do public relations. So as the documentary makes really clear, Bernays was not just a theorist. He ran his own PR firm, and he was very, very successful. We're talking about a guy who took Freud's theories and marketed cigarettes, marketed food. He marketed regime change. Right? It was not just manipulating public opinion for products, but for governments. With the United Fruit Company in the 1950s, he portrayed a democratically elected president of Guatemala, Arbenz, right, as a communist, allowing, right, in 1954 public opinion to be shifted in support of a coup d'etat that installed an authoritarian military junta. So let me walk you through these case studies. This is one of the things Century of the Self talks about. So again, I encourage you to watch this documentary. And it's one of Bernays' very first successful Freudian public relations campaigns. Remember, for Freud, we are irrational. We are acting on the basis of unconscious desires. Our unconscious desires are suppressed. We want things we shouldn't have. It's not socially acceptable. And what we do is we substitute socially unacceptable desires for acceptable things. But which acceptable things? That's where the manipulation comes in. So one of his very early campaigns was marketing cigarettes towards women. We're talking the 1920s, 1930s. There was a very strong social taboo against women smoking in public. And by social taboo, I mean it wasn't technically illegal, but it was kind of frowned upon. A social taboo in the sense of like a guy wearing a skirt is a social taboo. It's not illegal for a guy to wear a dress, but it's a social taboo. You're going to be like, what's going on? So women couldn't smoke. So what Bernays did was he associated smoking with political liberation for women at the time, the suffragette movement, women's votes. So he did this thing where he associated this taboo act with a suppressed desire for equality with men. And now Bernays could market cigarettes as what he called them torches of freedom. And again, with 100 years of hindsight, this seems like a really transparent marketing move. But he wanted to overcome the taboo, the social taboo, and he did it by linking the smoking of cigarettes to a suppressed desire of women, which was equality. So he did this publicity stunt. He had a bunch of women in 1929 march in the Easter's Day Parade in New York, smoking cigarettes. And he hired these women, and then he sent a press release to journalists as a kind of a fake group saying, oh, these women are going to be smoking cigarettes in the Easter Day Parade in support of women's lib and suffragism and women's votes and political equality with women. So, and it made headlines. All right, here's the New York Times, for example. Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom. So by associating cigarettes with this kind of like suppressed desire for equality, the cigarettes become the substitution for the thing you can't have. And here's Bernays saying, look, about his advertising campaign here. It should appear as news with no division of the publicity. Actresses should definitely be out. So he says, look, I'm going to blur the line between news and publicity to do this. Because if the news was publicity, people wouldn't buy it. But if young women who stand for feminism, someone from the Women's Party, could be secure, the fact that the movement would be advertised, that wouldn't be bad. In fact, that's the whole idea. They should be good looking. They should not be too model-y. They are to smoke simply as they come down the church steps, joining in the Easter parade, puffing away. So we have the association in the public's mind of this consumption behavior. We're going to buy something, we're going to consume something, we're going to be good consumers with a political ideal. And notice that whether or not the political ideal is good, bad, worthy, unworthy, that's in a way irrelevant to Bernays' case. What he's really saying is that as an advertising person, as somebody engaged in marketing, there's nothing to be said for smoking that's good. It's not rational to smoke. However, if I associate smoking with something people unconsciously want, freedom, equality, or consciously want for that matter, then I could, by linking the two in the mind, smoking will become the compensation for the thing you can't actually socially have yet. This is a thing that, of course, still happens today. I have a link here to pop culture critic Lindsay Ellis, who makes these really great YouTube videos. You should really check out her channel. And she has a video called Woke Disney, which is a critique of companies like Disney using politics as marketing. And this can help with sales in the short term, but can also appear cynical. And I think worse still, from my perspective, it can really undermine actual worthy causes. All right, so I mean, here's a scene from Avengers Endgame where you have all the female superheroes kind of lined up in a shot. Like, how likely is that to happen in an actual battle? Pretty unlikely. And you know, I liked this movie, and I'm not anti-feminist by any means. I just worry that stuff like this isn't actually in the service of actual politics. It's just marketing. And Bernays really is at the origin of this sort of thing. But it wasn't just getting women to smoke through clever public manipulation. Also, Bernays was involved in the manipulation of the masses in terms of politics. So again, back in the 1940s and 50s, you had a political situation in the Central American country of Guatemala. So if you know a little bit about Central American history, right, you'll see a pattern where indigenous lands in the 19th and 20th centuries were kind of taken by governments and just given to plantation owners and corporations. The United Fruit Company was the largest operating plantation owner in Central America. In fact, if you ever hear the term a banana republic, it's literally a reference to the fact that the United Fruit Company was basically running Central America for decades. So generally these places were run by and for these massive corporations, propped up by, you know, a military dictatorship like Jorge Ubico. In 1944, he was overthrown, and Guatemala had its first free elections. In the year 1950, Arbenz was elected in a democratic election that nobody disputes was free. And however, he implemented a series of agrarian reforms, and he was actually grabbing uncultivated land that people like the United Fruit Company owned, and he would just give them to poor peasants. And the United Fruit Company was in fact compensated for this land seizure at the value that they were taxed at, so that the assessment value. Now, the United Fruit Company was not happy with the actions of the Arbenz government in terms of its land reforms. And I'm bringing this up because the United Fruit Company hired Bernays as a lobbyist and asked him to kind of convince the U.S. government to take action in overthrowing the Arbenz government for communism. So Bernays appealed to fear of communism and these. You can't destroy global communism, but we can overthrow the government of Guatemala. Maybe that will be a good substitute. There was not a lot of evidence that there was any Soviet direction in Guatemala, but that doesn't matter. Bernays figured it out. He paid journalists to visit Guatemala, and they wrote reports based on interviews he had arranged with representatives he selected and had made sure they would say the right things. And in 1954, the CIA finally acted, giving an army officer weapons and funding, classified operations PB Fortune, PB Success. Armas assumed position as a dictator. He jailed and murdered his opponents. Guatemala basically never recovered. 40-year civil war resulted. And all this is a matter of public record. Bernays' publicity campaign on the behest of the United Fruit Company, making up evidence of a communist plot, is all public record. CIA operations in Guatemala are declassified. You can look it up at cia.gov. has declassified documents on PB Fortune saying, quote, only through military action can a new and stable government friendly to the U.S. be established promptly. Operation PB History tries to rewrite history, declassified documents, manufacturing evidence for Soviet presence in Guatemala. Again, under Bernays' direction, creating this PR campaign to secure the foreign policy direction that was desired by the United Fruit Company. So in the 20th century, the view that citizens couldn't be trusted with democracy, they had to be manipulated, and that public relations gave the people the tools to do so, was not used only for cigarettes. It was used to justify all kinds of foreign policy decisions. And again, if you're skeptical about this case I'm presenting here, I've given you links to the actual declassified CIA documents here. And 40 years later, the history staff at the CIA says, yeah, maybe this one was a bad idea. Imagine. Whoops. In light of Guatemala's unstable and violent history since the fall of Arbenz, we are perhaps less certain today than most Americans were at the time that this operation was a Cold War victory. So you can have a look again at these documents about the role of public relations in regime change in Guatemala and how propaganda works in these instances. Which brings us finally to the last thing I wanted to talk about today. Let me just look at the comments here. I've been live for an hour, so we're just going to wrap up with the propaganda model, which is due to Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their 1988 book Manufacturing Consent, which kind of takes a critical view of how Bernays and Freud were used to create the field of public relations and manipulate the masses in an effort to kind of control democracy. And again, the guiding insight of Bernays through Sigmund Freud is that you don't want to engage the public via rational arguments. As the 20th century has shown, humans are irrational. We're just not rational creatures. We are mostly guided by unconscious desires. We suppress unconscious desires and look for substitutes. So if I could find the right substitute, I can market you anything. Which is kind of like the general lesson for fake news I wanted to think about today. Then watch out for appeals to these unconscious drives, which are in effect really undermining democracy. So in Manufacturing Consent, Herman and Chomsky argue that mass media is itself really profoundly undemocratic. It serves to manufacture consent the way Bernays says. We want to. They're part of the invisible government of Bernays, and what we're trying to do is create consent for specific economic and foreign policy positions. And kind of the one. This is a book that was written in 1988, so it's a bit of an older book. It was definitely a book written before the internet. I mean, the internet existed in 1988, but it wasn't very. It was not really used outside of universities. But I guess the kind of question I want to ask when I'm looking and thinking about manufacturing consent is whether in an online age, where everybody has access to the tools of media production, are we just kind of caught between, on one hand, the chaos of the internet, the anything goes of it, and the maybe too rigid order of mass media, and we're just kind of caught between these two? And how can we escape? Right, this puzzle we have, this paradox we have. Let me walk you through the propaganda model, and then I'll ask the question again. Are we caught between the chaos of the internet and the order of mass media? So what is the order of mass media? So Manufacturing Consent argues that, look, news reported by mass media isn't made up. It's not, created out of whole cloth. However, it is shaped by the fact that it goes through a series of filters, and the filters catch some of this news and lets other news pass through. So these filters shape content, shape the tone, shape the point of view. And you think of it in terms of 5 filters or 5 biases. So in the book, they talk about ownership bias. Let me very quickly run through these. Ownership bias has to do with the fact that media is highly concentrated in ownership. We're talking about 4 or 5 companies that basically own all of mass media. So this ownership, this concentration of ownership also is going to imply concentration of points of views, and it'll be a reflection of the kinds of economic interests that large companies have. The second bias is advertising bias. The revenue source for media is largely advertising. And in fact, the content exists to get readers to see, or watchers or viewers or listeners to see the ads. If you cannot get people to watch the ads, you're going to create other content. A TV studio's goal is not to create good television, it's to create television that'll make people watch ads, fundamentally. So because the revenue source is advertising, the content cannot be anti-advertising. There's also, Chomsky and Herman talk about something called a sourcing bias. Brendan is asking, let me just pause here, would the U.S. evolved in Venezuela today trying to overthrow Maduro similar to Bernays in the 50s? I've definitely seen suggestions to that effect. I don't want to talk about Venezuela because it's such a politicized case right now, and I don't have access the way I do with Guatemala to like actual CIA documentation, primary sources where I can go like, here's really clear evidence of what's happening. So I don't have that for the Venezuelan case, and I use historical examples whenever I can to avoid getting drawn into contemporary controversial issues. But there is definitely a similarity there. And frankly, if you wanted to write a paper, Brendan, about that, I think that'd be an interesting topic, so you could send me an email. But, American involvement in regime change is obviously very well historically documented. Guatemala's a case, but there's no shortage of case studies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s about it, right? We have Nicaragua, we have Argentina, we have Indonesia. So is there a pattern here? Yeah, there's definitely a pattern. Back to the propaganda filters, right? We have concentration of media ownership, we have advertising, we also have a sourcing bias. Chomsky and Herman says, look, mass media relies to a certain extent, not fully, but to a certain extent, on official statements. They rely on having access to government sources, and they might be unwilling to compromise a sourcing relationship. This has been true of almost every administration. You can absolutely be punished by the government. You can be denied access to press briefings, for example, and you don't want to have an adversarial relationship with the press secretary, because then you'll just be thrown out, and then you won't have access anymore. So some of the kind of loyalty there can be explained by the sourcing bias. You don't want to have too adversarial a relationship. Flak bias. Flak, of course, refers to catching flak, which is like an anti-aircraft gun. So it's damage in a way. So you don't want to be damaged. You don't want complaints from advertisers because boycotts would be bad. Right? Organized consumer boycotts are one way to like attack media figures. You don't want to get attacks from lobby groups. If you get too many politicians mad, they might impose regulations on your corporate operations. In the early part of 2019, Facebook was remarkably friendly to the Trump administration because they wanted to avoid regulation coming from that administration. They wanted to like self-regulate. So you want to avoid getting people too angry at you. And finally, Chomsky says, look, there is what they call the fear bias. So in 1988, the book was written in the mid-'80s, so we're talking Cold War, we're talking Ronald Reagan, Soviet Union. and they said the main enemy bias, the main fear bias was anti-communism. Everyone has to be against the Soviets. They have to be portrayed as a huge imminent threat. After 9/11, Chomsky and Herman say, okay, everybody has to get on board with this war on terror. We have to make sure that we can't stray too far from this idea that the war on terror, the Iraq war, is a good thing. And indeed, most outlets in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 were friendly to the idea of the 2003 Iraq war. So what we have is a bias in terms, and again, this is Chomsky and Herman, and you can dispute these points here. There's a lot of literature on the propaganda model, and it's an empirical literature in the sense that you can actually go and look at news and then kind of say how many papers were in favor of this policy, how many papers were against it. And the documentary does a little bit of the job here. But roughly the idea is that mass media is going to be critical of official state enemies and usually pretty forgiving of state allies, regardless of their actual actions. So media will treat friendly dictators differently than they'll treat equally bad dictators that are official enemies. So I'm not a fan of, for example, Fidel Castro's Cuba. Of course, Castro's dead now. However, American media is typically extremely critical of Castro. But for comparable dictators in the 1970s and 80s, they barely said anything about allies, like General Pinochet or Suharto in Indonesia. So why is that? Well, technically, these dictators are allies, right? So, right, Saudi Arabia is a pretty authoritarian regime. But they're allies officially, so we don't condemn them too much, right? So there's this bias here, this kind of foreign policy bias in the media, according to Chomsky and Herman. So let me go back to this question I wanted to ask about the propaganda model, which was written in the 1980s, and the internet, which in the Web 2.0 kind of social media post, 2005-ish. We have an explosion of social media and like bottom-up citizen-based content creation, increasingly corralled through various movements. So what I want to ask is, look, citizens, as I've noticed in this course, are really aware of the limits of mass media. And if you ask people why they're distrustful of mass media, why trust in mass media is at an all-time low, most people are going to say things that sound a lot like the propaganda model. They're going to say, well, it's a bunch of big companies, they have political biases, they're afraid of, scaring their advertisers. But that's just propaganda model. Kind of criticisms. What distrust in media has not resulted in is more independent journalism. It's in fact kind of created a couple problems. One problem it's created is a new kind of movement of conspiracy theories and echo chambers. And I'm thinking of things like Alex Jones and InfoWars, right? The idea that mass shootings are fake, they're false flags, conspiracy theories about vaccines, conspiracy theories about crisis actors, right? People are being pushed towards these echo chambers where distrust in mass media doesn't mean that they have a bias, but that everything's fake. And the conspiracy theory explains how it's fake. So that's a problem that distrust in mass media has created. Rather than analyze the biases and compensate for them, we just reject mass media entirely. The other problem is that this distrust, in some cases, has led to people capitalizing on distrust to manipulate people, to push them towards really hyper-partisan sources through confirmation bias. So if you're distrustful of some segment of media, another segment of media can say, yes, that's because they're all politically biased. Unlike us, we believe what you believe. And of course, confirmation bias works really effective because nobody thinks of themselves as believing false things, because if they were false things, you wouldn't believe them. So any outlet that confirms what you already believe is trustworthy. because you believe these things. So really hyper-partisan sources on both the left and the right. You know, if we remember the media bias chart from early in the semester, right over here we have Fox News and Breitbart, which are partisan right sources. Over here we have like MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, right, also partisan sources. And the people that watch one or the other only trust one or the other, and they say, oh, I distrust the mass media, I only trust this one, but that's just part of the media. So we're really caught. On the one hand, we have internet chaos of conspiracy theory, and on the other hand, we have hyper-partisanship caused by distrust. So how do we escape this problem? I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. I do want you to do a couple things for this class, which is one, watch all these part of these documentaries. I don't want to tell you how to solve this problem or what media to watch, except for these documentaries. I do want you to just think a little critically about all these sources of information, and if you can have a strategy that allows you to kind of get above the din, above the noise, and see if you can find mechanisms to have information that's at least relatively healthy. So this documentary, three-part documentary, it's very long. Part one talks about Freud and Bernays and the manipulation of irrationality in a democracy. It's called Century of the Self. Part one is called Happiness Machines, and it talks about some of the content I've talked about here, about Freud and public relations. It's a really great documentary. If you're going to watch one thing I suggest you as a video, I think this is the one you should watch. I also have here the documentary version of Herman and Chomsky's book Manufacturing Consent, which is actually it's a Canadian documentary that walks you through the Chomsky-Herman propaganda model and some of the evidence for it. I think I'll also, if you do a little bit of research on, for example, the Wikipedia article on the propaganda model has really nice critiques of it as well. I encourage you to look at those critiques and, of course, stay critical of what I'm saying. And that's really what I wanted to talk about this week. So let me just get right back to the start here. So what's coming due? Do your online quiz. Work on your short essay. These are the two big things that are due next. Again, I just want a couple pages of your thoughts on one of the course topics. Please answer one of the questions I give you on FOL. If you want to do it on a different topic, send me an email. After that, turn your case study into a presentation. Right? As if you were working for Snopes and you had to debunk something through like a presentation. And finally, there'll be a third quiz. I'm calling it the final test. That's also going to be online for the entire last week. So those are the things I need you to finish up. My guarantee to you is that you can't fail this class if you do the work. So do the work, pass the class, and you'll be doing great. All right. Thanks so much for watching today. If you have any questions or comments, send me an email. All right. I have to go teach another class.